evening, everyone. This is Just Divine with Team 2MK for another Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge. Today we have a sort of free-form-ish lounge. Character select off. You are looking for Just Vine today, and we will be discussing some of our more advanced content, I suppose you could say. Basically, Brillian and I will be going over advanced uses for bots, in-depth pages on our site, which normally goes over additional uses for the bot or just explains how the bot teaches you, stuff like that. So, right now, let's get this show out on the road. I know Amara has been doing some training in lounges lately, and I have not fought an Abigail on Bison in a bit.
We in fact used the Bison bot just before this to do exactly what bots are for, to get the player back used to the idea of how the matchup goes, to remind them of all the little pieces. Similar to how when we create one for the purposes of getting prepared for tournaments, for example. Our bots normally, except for like 3 of them, do a good enough job of teaching you certain aspects of the character that are either their first order strategies or the ones you really need to understand how to deal with. Abigail versus Bison tends to be a little bit hard for Abigail, because Bison is actually fairly evasive and Abigail tends to attack relatively straightforward. Bison's defense is often good, Just Vine's defense is better than many. And it leads to a sort of frustrating game if you don't know how to actually handle Abigail with specific purpose. These 2 players are quite used to dealing with each other as a whole, so not everything will come down to direct matchup issues, but there's still some stuff to be thinking about in this regard. Abigail's advantages, therefore, come when he can get very close, and when he can't, he has to hold back at least somewhat on the amount of effort put into doing that until you get quite good. And even when you get quite good, the way that Abigail moves, the length of his forward and back dashes, his general, as noted before, straightforward types of attacks, and Bison's strong ability to whiff punish a lot of those attacks, even if you can't whiff punish them into big damage all the time, mean that dealing with this character can be a little bit stressful unless you know some basic principles of it. So as usual, we did have some discussion as to how to try to play this matchup, the core principles of how you'd go about this when you really want to play Abigail in Amara's style. But it's one of those things where you understand things by withholding specific things you're used to doing, while not trying to lose too much of your actual style, because you might still like doing those things, but you still need to put some layers in so that you can do them. That's the usual thing we're trying to teach after all, not the correct way to play the matchup directly, as you may just not like playing it that way, but the way to add enough layers to your particular style of playing it that you get to do what you want at least some of the time. Abigail's stress in this matchup, as mentioned, is it's really hard for him to get close to Bison if you don't have a very particular mindset. One thing that helps here is his jumping heavy kick, and it can also be his neutral jump heavy kick. This is a little hard to time, but if Bison is willing to play footsies with you and is winning out because you're getting whiff punished or whatever, this move becomes powerful because Bison cannot actually tell whether or not he can whiff punish this move. The other is Abigail's incredibly good standing medium punch. Whereas managing to hit Bison with stand heavy punch or crouch heavy punch can be very difficult. Stand medium punch has a lot of range and tends to knock Bison out of the startup of a lot of things. In fact, this is a common thing for this character. Despite his ability to almost always be plus in mean situations, he's actually fairly bad at dealing with players and characters who have long, swinging attacks that interrupt or in any way avoid his hitboxes. On Chun-Li, this is done with crouch heavy punch, for example, and with Abigail, it's done with stand medium punch. Unfortunately, the stand medium punch is not likely to help you get in, and you just have to be annoying with it mostly. But with those two main tools, you added enough layers where the Bison player sees you taking something that looks like a risk and wants to do something slightly different. This may cause them to come closer, or it may cause them to back off in a way that lets them get walked to the corner. The one thing that does have to basically get held back, though, is Abigail doesn't get to run against Bison that much. A prepared Bison player is usually going to get Abigail out of the run one way or the other, or force you to spend a lot of meter to not get a lot of damage. And since Bison's movement often leads to you getting faked out of things like EX Abigail Punch, and you can't just use it because you know his good strings are all the same type, for example, it's difficult to rely on this move as well. You can, however, focus your meter usage into the EX command grab in situations and positions where Bison sticks out a limb and you end up grabbing it. Light command grab also works on this, but it's easy enough to just do things with that one because you get much more damage and setups out of it. Abigail is, after all, about maximizing damage, and Bison's wake-up game is not the greatest, so it's quite important to be able to think of ways to get him downed for sure, and therefore take control of the situation. But as for us, let's fill the lounge a bit. As usual, the servers are still being slightly strange, at least about who can and cannot enter the lounge, or rather, who can and cannot see it. Meaning that if we want the gang to all be here, we have to go through a little more work.
while they are setting that up, in case you did not pay attention to CEO, Bon-chan did win that event, and I think in second was Fujimura. Fudo made 5th this time instead of the usual second place, which I personally was surprised by given how really consistent he is in getting that, especially when he makes top 8. I don't think I've seen him below second place in a top 8 in quite a while. In other news, apparently SNK is going to be sponsoring quite a few different tournaments and events, as is Team Ninja, so we'll get to see a lot more competitive play for like Samurai Showdown, DOA, even KOF. Something I have a little more practice with. Hopefully our 46th president ends up being able to see the lounge, as I would really like some G practice. Seems like every time I come on he ends up not being able to see me or show up.
Well, after all, you can just directly invite people without actually knowing. Like,
yeah, that's true.
So we can probably just try and see if he's around. But this is actually partially the reason why we rotate who does create the lounge, as it can be really confusing lately to just not be able to see lounges for various reasons. One of the most important things bots can do for you, even if you know the matchup well, is help you find strange interactions or crazier interactions between your buttons or your tactics and the opposing characters' hitboxes and hurtboxes without having to test these out in real matches. And since it is at least somewhat predictable, but not entirely predictable, you get both sides of it. You have to be able to see whether or not you can respond consistently, even to something that's not completely telegraphed, On top of that, whether or not the move you actually intend to use works at every spacing, since the bots will move around enough to create a similar looking situation with slightly different spacing. Again, basically all, save for like a different three, do more or less all of their available moves, even if some of those moves are quite rare. Street Fighter V, however, unlike many games, does not actually have the capacity for you to simulate online input lag, meaning that you don't know for sure if everything you do against bots you'll be able to do against players, or rather online players. Still, it gives you a good starting ground, and if you're the sort of person who plays offline or goes to tournaments, it also helps you because you are able to see specifically, I can react to this, I can do this thing. I can't do it online, but I shouldn't make game plans that involve letting my opponent do this thing, because I actually can stop it. The condition under which I can stop it might not be the type that lets me win ranked, casual, or even battle lounge matches where you can directly shift your connection to probably the best possible if you choose the right people to fight. But one way or another, you get to keep some extra data without necessarily having to be able to find a player of that character.
I know for me this has actually helped me greatly in recent tournaments, as I only really have access to online players for Guile. And even though one of them was able to do some very long sets with me, I play a couple of them very frequently, there's just some stuff that I just wasn't able to do in that matchup online. But once I got the extra training as I was preparing to fight Guile, I ended up being able to go back to the bot and see all of the pieces being added on top of what I already had as a base from training with the bot. So I was able to do things against the bot that I wasn't able to do before, and I was able to do things against the bot that I was not necessarily able to do against the online players because of connection. So that gave me a much stronger base of confidence when going into tournament. And confidence is a huge factor when it comes to tournament play.
This actually brings us back to why we don't always have bots use the safest or the best strategies as well. You will rarely throw in some sequences, some moves, that not only do you need to learn to punish them, but things like sweep, like simply having particular characters with fairly long sweep ranges just do sweep. Not necessarily because this is difficult to punish, although in some cases they obviously are, but simply to put you in the same mindset of you have to focus on everything else, but you still want that sweep punish to be an immediate instant thing when your opponent decides to throw it out for what might feel like no reason. If you are defensive enough, you're not likely to get caught too much by those things. But it won't help you if you have the opponent take a huge risk, that risk not pay off, but you're not used to it or you're not thinking about it, because usually at higher levels you're not. You're not expecting your opponent to do anything particularly risky, and sometimes that means they get away with it because you're just not primed to give a damaging response, or at least a damaging enough response. Having that built into your muscle memory through long hours of training mode, but not only that, in the case of characters who can, for example, space their sweep particularly well to change which your best punish is, building this up can be a lot more help to you than fighting someone who either knows specifically when to use it and therefore by the time you've encountered it twice, they've decided to stop using it because you've blocked twice. You don't get to prime yourself to do it. You fight a match or two, you block sweep, somehow don't punish, your opponent decides, okay, that's enough of that, and then you never get the chance again.
I always find Nashbot in particular interesting and difficult at the same time to fight for that exact reason. I would say it's embarrassing of how much I get swept by that bot, but that's sort of in the design, so... But you get so used to online play where you don't want to make a mistake, you don't want to leave yourself open. And everyone's thinking very similar things. So you don't as often get that one crazy dude that just really knows how to sweep. And those are some of the fights we end up enjoying the most, right? Since it's novel, it's fun, it adds something to the puzzle just because they have a different style. But if you're unprepared, it can be frustrating, especially if you encounter them frequently. Or if it, say, keeps you from being able to fight the top player in your bracket or whatever. Whoops.
We are very aware, after all, that there is at least somewhat a subculture of players who will defeat you with a shenanigan or trick and then not fight you anymore because you didn't have a counter to it. Whereas those people would be either willing to take you more seriously, willing to be less, whatever you want to call the thing they're being about it, or just consider you stronger if you had that sort of capacity to stop this strategy that they're using. And we find these people even in battle lounges, people who join battle lounges and use tactics that are more so meant to test the player's ability to react or punish than necessarily this is a great tactic. In other words, if you used this tactic against a player who was super experienced against it, they would just bait it and constantly destroy you. However, this doesn't help you if you aren't able to actually punish it. Bots for us are often helpful in dealing with those players, either driving them off because they are the type who don't have another strategy and just wanted to, we might as well call it being a bully, but not necessarily. They wanted to use that strategy, and if you defeat it, they'd leave. Or they recognize, oh, you can actually play this game on the level where I have to try, and they try. Or switch character to try to do something else with someone else. But either way, you still get something out of this that you wouldn't be able to get if they just beat you up, cause you to have a relatively unfortunate or unhappy experience, and then left. This is particularly unhelpful when the lounge is lots of people, and you losing due to this tactic just means that they go through and nearly everyone else has to go around, and you never get your rematch. This is always the hard part of this matchup. Once Abigail is really far away from Bison, he has to do a lot of specific timing related things to get in on things like the run. And it's usually quite dependent on which move Bison chooses to use to try to stop him. Avalanche gets over one set of things, Run parry gets through a certain set of things, and punch can be timed so that it catches Bison out of other set of things. But a defensive player doesn't get hit by things like Giant Flip all that often, and basic mix-ups with the run tend to get no. And then we see there Abigail's glorious jump back medium kick. This is a moment where Abigail can just run, and it doesn't even have to be ES run, he can just normal run. But making the decision on what to do at the beginning of the run usually means that Bison will react. So it's super hard to actually do it. Still, if you've decided, okay, this has been enough dancing and I want to run at them, you can get away with it. Because Bison doesn't like being walked to the corner more than most characters, he actually suffers from this. Despite the fact that he can normally do things like Devil Reverse to get out, these are not really good plans against Abigail a lot of the time. And there's a good chance if you are having a walk down situation like that in this match, Abigail is close to having a lot of meter. At the beginning of a match, for example, Bison doesn't have a lot of really great ways to stop Abigail from just doing regular run. He can do it, but the timing and it means that there's at least enough of a gamble that you have to think about it. And Abigail basically shrugs off things like Psycho Inferno, so. Now, because he doesn't build up so much meter situations, deciding the right moment to use it is basically the entire thing.
Whew.
One interesting timing, if you've gotten enough of the play set up, is that Abigail can in fact use EX Run as a punish to Scissor Kick. As this is the one situation in which Bison is usually not prepared for the EX Run. He will also try to bait it sometimes, but as you've seen there, the situations in which he wants to bait it means that he wants to walk backward or jump out or something else that gives Abigail some advantage on those moments where he actually doesn't run. This is not a winning strategy, this is a call-out style strategy. It's not really a shenanigan because Bison can deal with it, but you can deal with your opponents based on their current mindset. If you can feel out what they're trying to do or want to do, then that's it. I was so sure that was going to work. I was so sure that was going to work. But apparently it does not.
I was not expecting that to get parried. I suppose the cross-up doesn't matter if you parry it.
Everyone should remember that, yes, all parry characters can in fact just parry Bison's V-trigger to explosion at the timing it would run out and explode. Now for most of these characters this means nothing, and I guess we don't know yet what it means for Abigail, because we've not gotten to see it. But we know that, for example, there are a lot of situations in which Colleen and Ryu can do crazy things. Colleen does not get as much, but Ryu, especially in his V-trigger 2, can definitely hit you for this. Sadly, I'm fairly sure that we do not have that move into our Bison bot, and I don't think it can easily be added, but maybe we'll take a look at it. He definitely does have some stuff he doesn't need as much. Back in Metro City, one of our most fighting gaming backgrounds, honestly. Fairly retro, presumably because that was the style. Sundare's been building up that very precise spacing and uses of Hadoukens. This is something you can actually punish on a very few set of characters. Oh, he did find a room. But more importantly than punishing it, you have to understand how to take advantage of the footsies that comes out of it, from both sides. Akuma is usually better equipped to take advantage of the footsies than anyone else. But one of your better options against Akuma's fireballs, which is really, really not well seen, is that a lot of the time you can backdash them. And if he's using the fireball to set up a spacing in which you will be disadvantaged, and you have enough health to risk taking the hit, this is almost always what you want to do. There are some characters where you want to jump at them when they throw a projectile, no matter what. A few characters where you definitely want to block it and just take the hit and get pushed back, like Guile. Guile is, for example, one of those characters where he doesn't really benefit from the pushback on his projectiles most of the time, except at closer ranges. If he's at the outrange where he doesn't have to worry about actually playing footsies and is throwing sonic booms, for a lot of characters in the game, your best option is to let him push you back with them. Don't even try to walk back in immediately. Force the Guile player to adopt a rhythm, and unless they're super good, you're not necessarily going to have to worry about the fact that that rhythm is happening. Well, part of the reason why charge characters, in particular Bison, cares about this is because if you learn to keep yourself calm enough in the face of these things, you can backdash and begin a down back charge. Which means you have a lot of responses for things Akuma does, whether he wants to walk forward, throw another projectile of a different kind, or just go for some dash-up mix-up style thing, since he doesn't often dash into a space where he could actually grab you and therefore must hit buttons. If your character's backdash is around 24 frames, this may not apply to you. But Bison has one of the faster and relatively long for its speed backdashes in the game. It's not that long. But it's definitely enough to cause this sort of problem to Akuma when you expect there to be footsies, but fireballs may be involved. Other characters who can do this relatively easily are Colleen and Ed, and both of them also benefit from this tactic. Akuma can of course beat it with any number of things, but those things often force him to commit much harder than the fireball and to use up more resources in a few cases. Therefore it becomes a dance between the two as to should I bother to throw this fireball or not. The fireball is a very real part of the footsies game, and sometimes using the red one will be stressful, but Bison is also not a character that terribly punishes red fireballs, so maybe you'll get away with it. As you can see therefore just now, the better option is to just use this tactic more when the opponent is cornered or near enough to the corner that their backdash won't be enough. Mid-screen though, you might want to hold off on the fireballs or put more effort into mixing them up. This is something that comes up in matches quite a lot. Having to specifically think about when you are going to need resources in the future and therefore not using them when you don't need them yet. One of the more difficult things to recognize in lower level play, for example, is whether or not a particular Ryu player is likely to use EX fireballs in the mid-screen or close to the corner, as it usually demonstrates two completely different mindsets about the character.
Ah, there we go. Looks like we get El Presidente after all.
One of the things that makes this matchup hard for Alex is actually really interesting. The fact is that Bison has basically the longest forward jump in the game, which means he's one of the few characters that can reliably stay outside of Alex's range for a lot of things without having to actually care. The threat of Bison either sliding or jumping, or in V-Trigger 2 Psycho Crusher, means that there's really little or no way for Alex to directly engage him without putting himself at risk. Therefore, he has to take a very similar approach to Abigail, using stand medium punch quite a lot, not spending as much time with his basic moves. Many players prefer to use V-Trigger 2 here because it lets them convert better at the ranges that these two tend to engage. Or just neutral jump heavy kick with basically the same plan. But as the Bison player, your concept should be you can stay a little bit further away because this is one of the characters with the least damaging anti-airs in the game, whereas you have the longest jump in the game, as well as a bunch of other options that don't put you in the same space but still stress out the opponent. This is compounded by Bison's ability to just straight up dash through Alex's footsie buttons if you understand the timings and spacings of the opponent. Therefore, similar to the Lara versus Alex matchup, a lot of your goal is to dash out of your own pressure strings, as Alex is also one of the characters with the least straight-up dangerous punishes for this setup. Finishing your pressure against him is not really that necessary. He's not likely to be opened up. The player is not losing out on anything from holding down bat for a long period, and you just generally don't benefit as much as occasionally throwing in the bat dash to take you back out of his range to your own comfort zone. Alex can barely react to this bat dash even if he is completely expecting it, because he doesn't know when in the string this will happen. That is one of the main benefits that Bison and Lara style characters have. They can vary the length of their string long enough that you don't know at which point in it they want to do the bat dash. And in order to attempt to catch the bat dash, you often put yourself in the position of facing their very strong whiff punishy pull back hurt box before hitting buttons. This is actually something we saw last year at Shine, which we'll probably be returning to this year, in one of Just Fine's matches specifically. It was not overused as a whole thing, and it didn't actually directly affect the match that much in terms of when the damage was done, but it did affect how the match was played. Careful, less aggressive players can be pulled into more aggressive mindsets using this tactic as a general thing, but note that it does not work so well on very precise characters who have very specific and easy to recognize strings, i.e. characters like Chun-Li and to some extent Fang don't really backdash out of their own pressure. Characters with longer, slower backdashes like Abigail can get away with it sometimes, depending on the opponent's mental state, but mostly since he doesn't have very variable things, he can hit like medium punch through 2 times versus 3 times, and that's about it. Nor does he benefit that much from being at precisely that space, whereas Bison constantly benefits in this sort of match from being just outside their footsie range and able to perform these long jumps, put himself on the other side of them, possibly empty jump, and be just outside of throw range and just generally be annoying. While the side will stay in the lounge, this is probably Mara's actual last played match of the night. As this is the end of a fairly long day. Never forget to assess your performances specifically based on how tired you are, and if you can build up a concept of how being tired affects your play, you can even train that in particular ways. This is, however, a thing you can actually use in a match. Rather than trying to push yourself to play correctly for the entire match, if you know you have a tendency to do certain things that are not as safe, focus for a bit on setting up your opponent's expectations such that they expect you to play quote-unquote as properly as possible. And then just go ham. Like, let all your instincts and everything else come through, because that in itself, unless your character's options are really bad against the opposing character, are effectively a sort of mix-up. While it's generally a bad idea to just have, let's call it unsafe craziness, as your main strategy, if you realize that you cannot hold together long enough, do the best you can to convince your opponent that you intend to play safely, so that when you eventually tire of doing so and go in or do all of that thing, those crazy things, they're at least somewhat set up to deal with something else. And since technically neither you nor they know when those things are coming, you have a higher chance of taking them by surprise. You might even take yourself by surprise. And that is again where bots tend to help. Simply by getting you so used to this, and to the relatively random shifts in bots, that when you are faced with this thing, your body does the work for you.
All right. can't remember if this is the first time or the second time I have fought the 46th president, but I am highly looking forward to it. I have done quite a bit of G-Bot, and I've sought out quite a few rounds with a couple of G players during Combo Breaker and Frosty Fausting. So I'm hoping to see if all of my work has paid off.
Both of these characters are a threat to each other because of their ability to explosively approach, which can make this matchup frustrating if you're not the type of person who likes gambling. They also tend to trade really often. And this is, I believe, the second time, because the first time we were discussing the fact that you should generally test AG first by attempting a couple Devil Reverse head stomps to figure out what their reaction to this is. If their reaction is V-skill, you know you can jump, because they're less likely to anti-air perfectly. But that's about it. As you can see though, this match does often become about V-reversals, on both sides actually, because neither of them can afford to let the other get too close to them without getting at least some advantage out of it. Every whiffed move has at least some chance of being hit by your opponent's relatively strong one, and neither character has great enough wake up that if they use their good knockdown, that it will turn out well. Bison can basically save his meter for EX, Scissor Kick knockdowns, and EX head stomp knockdowns, as you've just seen, and basically get to pressure G almost indefinitely, or bait the super on wake up, any number of things. This is very frustrating. G similarly can extend quite a few of his things and use EX, wheel kick, and I don't remember if it's upper or under or over that does it. One of them has a good knockdown relative to Bison anyway. That makes this match seem fairly swingy, but if you're familiar enough with the characters that you are the one playing them, it's more so that you just accept and understand that, oh, this situation has gotten bad because I've done a thing that got me hit by this knockdown, so now I don't get to do much.
Whew, that was super close. Activating that V-trigger was so risky on my part. Ugh.
Fortunately, neither player can usually afford to spend a lot of time waiting and watching for the other to do something, as they both have safe moves that are usually not rewarding per se, but definitely stressful to the other. Bison can usually find a good timing to scissor kick or shadow axe, or psycho axe even. And G can send out G burst as much as he wants without really putting himself at too much risk most of the time. If neither one is willing to specifically do these things as their setup for something else, then it just becomes a matter of dancing around in neutral and waiting for the other to make a mistake, but not being able to just go, okay, I'm going to wait a long time until they mess up, because they will, and they can and will just keep on doing relatively safer things.
Ah!
While I would not call it a match where white damage is a thing that really affects how it turns out, you definitely get to see a lot of it when one player has decided that they're just going to wait for the other to make a mistake. I see we are evenly matched. One of the other things that becomes very important in this matchup is recognizing when you have the option to change your knockdown, or for example, just not wake up quickly, and when this can have a large enough effect on your match that you should attempt to specifically employ it. Since neither character has directly good wake up most of the time, they have to spend a lot more time thinking about, wait, was that knockdown one where the opponent gets Oki? Do I need to try to change the way I got knocked down so that they do different ones? At high levels, players will just build this up in advance, literally have concepts of when they intend to wake up with particular things. Because you actually can say beforehand, okay, well, the way this match normally goes, I'm eventually going to get hit by this. And there's the aforementioned, these characters tend to trade a lot.
That was fabulous. Not only did we both time out, we also... that's the best.
As the G player's range and understanding of buttons improves, they're less likely to get punished by Bison, but they're not actually at liberty to hit different buttons. You see a lot of situations here where the President's moves barely whiff, but this isn't necessarily to say, oh, he should use a different move. It's actually that if he were to use a different move, then it would be easier for Bison to hit buttons in that space, because he would not get hit and then still stick an actual attack into the space and often hit G. Right now you see those buttons withheld, basically that no medium kicks, no medium punches really. Even at ranges where, oh, well, G is going to whiff at this point because of reasons. The precise range that they end up at a lot of the time means that there's just no good button to hit from either side. Unfortunately, I can't say I understand the matchup well enough at higher level to say whether or not G should continue to hit the buttons and whiff them into empty space or not. I would presume that eventually you need to stop hitting them. But it might be more like a mix-up, where you don't really have the option to just never hit them.
Phew! Oof, this is fun. My anticipation was not in vain.
Bison's best option for this is actually to just go for the crouch medium kick. This will often get him hit by the wheel kick or one other move that G does that I don't remember right now. and therefore you have to be willing to take this hit. But sometimes you just have to live with it, because otherwise you will be stuck in too dangerous a situation to just leave it. This is particularly true when you're near the corner, but again, this comes down to the sort of thing we were talking about before. Just Fine is a player who doesn't naturally just hit a bunch of buttons, meaning that doing so occasionally will prime the opponent to think in terms of how to deal with the medium kick being hit, for example. And then if things go wrong, or she gets tired of the focus of it, or something similar, what will actually happen is she'll stop doing it, but they will probably still be in the mindset of thinking, oh, I should be expecting and thinking about that medium kick, which will then never come. Depending on what this allows one to set up, it is itself a strength. Especially if you're not the sort of player like me, for example, who can just be literally completely random. When Bison is on offense, he can use the offensive V reversal in similar ways to Abigail to try to keep G under control in the corner, but he also doesn't benefit as much as Abigail from keeping G cornered. So you might want to save it for when the tide almost inevitably turns and G smacks Bison all the way back to the corner, or tries to. At that mid-ish range that you just saw though, where you are not quite in the corner yet, but you can V reversal G into the corner, it can be helpful.
See you in midterms. Oof, that was fun. Also stressful. Gbot really helped me in being able to pull off that Bison slide in that matchup for sure. And I definitely knew places where not to stop and when to stop, which is something I normally have trouble with against the character.
Noting in advance that our lounge is not going for as long as usual today. The stream will probably end a bit earlier as well, but normally the lounge continues for quite a bit longer after the stream ends. Today that will not be the case, and you can assume that when the stream ends, the lounge will also end. So bear that in mind if you want to get any matches with anyone here, as I don't think anyone will be sticking around. We're all heading off to do other things. Akuma is actually another character where Bison benefits at least somewhat from backdashing out of his own pressure. Because of the way that certain of Akuma's moves work, his defensive options don't tend to catch Bison all that well. Unlike characters like Ed and Colleen, however, Bison can prime himself for a very specific reaction right after it, similar to just backdashing the Hadoukens. It's a different reaction that's needed, but you can still have more or less the same mindset regarding it. This is likely to show up a lot more easily lately because of Just by being able to spend a lot of time in Kata 32 and 33 practice with Mika and Larabots. However, this isn't directly an advantage, as unlike against Alex, for example, while this is neutral and definitely not likely to end up with Bison getting hit with something and then put into the Akuma blender with his relatively bad wake-up options, this just puts them back to a neutral that doesn't really change too much if the Akuma player just does not immediately chase. So it's more so a frustration tactic on a player you've managed to play very well defensively against, rather than them getting to wait until you end your string or mess up, you backdash out and start the whole process again. Since Akuma's better jump-ins and buttons also don't really work as well at the range that Bison likes to stand at, as mentioned, he tends to use a lot of energy to have this fight work out in his favor. If you watch it in general, actually, you'll realize, even at high level play, if you're used to a player of this character having a lot of meter to use stuff with, and you watch them fight a Bison player, they usually don't have as much meter, and they usually don't have as many options as a result. This is also a relatively effective thing against Kage, but Kage converts more easily off of certain moves, and therefore can take bigger risks with bigger payoff than Akuma can. Akuma gains the ability to take approximately the same level of risk payoff while he is in V-Trigger, but that implied that he is lower on health, and if he does mess it up, Bison can delete him with the remaining meter on that side. Since, as you can see, Bison doesn't tend to need as much meter in this matchup. But even these options that Akuma gains are not things that Bison can't beat. Meaning that often, the moment where Akuma can go for the kill is when Bison has used all his meter, somehow, and therefore can no longer do things like ES Devil Reverse. This is a very meter watching heavy match in general. For Akuma, while this is not really a metered fight, it's the careful management of power and expectations. He more often needs his metered attacks as reactions or reads, and cannot necessarily afford to use them for pressure as much, despite Alex's wake-up not being the greatest. This has more to do with the difference between their health than the fact that, hey, punching Alex repeatedly is a bad idea. It's more so that eventually, if you do mess up in any way with your pressure, Alice is the character who is probably among the most equipped to really hurt Akuma very quickly. And while he can't necessarily keep it going to the level of others, he also has enough of an advantage when he doesn't push too hard in the neutral that you don't necessarily get to turn it around. You're looking for that moment to get in first. If you overextend once you've gotten that opening and get Alex, and Alex gets to hit you, sometimes he'll just equalize health without too much effort on his part. It's hard to say which V-trigger is better for Alex in this situation, but it definitely can be said once a player has specifically decided to play it safe on wake up and not take too much advantage of Alex's weaker wake up options, you can get just as much out of V-trigger 2, since it helps Alex convert into better situations when he does happen to catch Akuma doing something. Sledgehammer works better against very aggressive Akuma players, and I guess you could say that the DDT and similar things work better, or at least just as well, against more laid-back Akuma players. Of course, most Akuma players are versatile enough that they'll just change the style depending on what Alex's V-trigger is, but even this is in itself a form of a read that you have to deal with, and at least by choosing something you've induced something, hopefully. If you ask most higher level players how they think you should get better at the game once you understand it, they'll just tell you to play more. We're not necessarily high level players, but we'll tell you the same thing. We did spend a lot of time figuring out whether or not playing more is enough against just bots. And so far, we have found with almost certainty across the board that if you play more against bots, you do become more able to fight certain higher level players. However, the bots do not seem able to easily close the gulf between basically the get out of bronze concept if you fought effectively all of them enough and understood it, you will probably end up silver. With most of our shifts being seen from people who don't have enough time to fight them all or don't have all of the bots. But as originally expected, a lot of the things that you want them for that aren't just reactions have to do with your own mindset and growth as a player, which often comes from facing things that are triggered by your opponent's effect on your emotions more so than their actual specifics of playstyle. If you know what you're looking at and someone can explain to you how you're supposed to beat it, just getting into the habit of being able to recognize something and react to the something. You can try it in training mode, and again, quite a few of our bots have specific spots that you don't need the last input for. In fact, particular ones where the opponent is able to do many things specifically have these spots. Rashid and Ken are most obvious examples. Laura is actually also one of these. Characters with more straightforward-ish game plans that involve manipulating spacings or your expectations, the bot usually doesn't need this and can take up the entire slot. But Nash, Ken, Rashid, they all have an input that you can just go, okay, I don't need that one right now. It's easy to put back in if it comes to that. I'll just change it to whatever craziness my opponent was doing, and that allows you to put that as part of the bot, meaning that you can react to it or learn to react to it within a context of something other than it just being repeated. Of course, you can also use it in the standard way, just using that space by itself to get used to it first, and then reactivating all together and seeing what happens. We mention this sort of thing now because this is actually part of what is going to be used for the expansions of the in-depth versions of the bot pages. Letting you know not only whether or not you should use this, we do tend to indicate it somewhat, but we more or less just hit it with a blanket statement of if either action 1 or action 5 was really easy to replace, you're probably supposed to do it with that one. I think there's one bot where it's in action 4 or where I had to fix it later, but you get the idea. The in-depth section also gives you a lot of other things you can use bots for, partially by changing these things, or just different ways to look at things for specific matchups. Meaning that you're much more likely to see mentions of things like that. For this character, change this input to this thing because they have trouble dealing with it, or in order to create a situation that is more likely for the matchup. There's no set schedule for the release of those. In fact, we probably won't even necessarily announce when we update in-depth pages. But there will often be some way of knowing, especially since when we do add an in-depth section, it will tend to be basically all of it at once, as it often means we'll have just decided, hey, everyone, let's figure out what we want to add to this page so we can do it all at once. Meaning that many pages that don't have in-depth now at all would go to having basically full things, and you then wouldn't have to worry too much about there being very incremental additions over time. That said, if we do make any such incremental additions, we are much more likely to mention those, even if it's only on the site's front page.
Mm-hmm. Looks like there was a little trouble with the connection.
One of the harder parts of this matchup is simply the fact that Akuma has to dash into Bison's buttons and Simmer quite a lot. And that is mostly about recognizing when the player is about to defend, or when one can get close enough to be checked that you end up not being checked, or that at least if you are checked, you are blocking and at a range that is advantageous to you directly after the pushback from the blocking. Bison can, however, deal with this with Light Punch in a lot of ways, and it's a good check for him, whereas he was adjusted in some season, which I don't even remember right now, that his Light Kick is no longer as good an option on block in those scenarios.
That was season 2.
I think. I thought it was 2 where he got the 3-frame Light Kick. That thinking those are probably at the same time. 0.5 patches and all that. Committing to these dashes, or even sometimes not quite reacting but thinking along the same lines, benefits Akuma because his forward dash is better than Bison's back dash. In fact, this is just a general true thing across the game. Characters with fast forward dashes can chase characters with certain back dashes, i.e. most characters actually, because most characters have fairly long back dashes. Bison actually, as mentioned before, doesn't have a particularly long back dash in terms of frames, but Akuma's forward dash is good enough that it doesn't really matter. Well, our lounge is full now, and as we mentioned before, it's extremely unlikely that the lounge will be continuing any longer than the stream is today. And the stream is almost certainly going to end in around 20 minutes more. Players with long buttons can hit both Bison and Alex out of their various stomp moves by basically predicting it and sticking a button into that space to attack basically their head. This is the reason why the aforementioned medium punch from Abigail works on Bison, and why G's forward heavy punch, I believe it is, works the same way on Alex. This is again mostly more of a call-out read situation, as you will lose fairly heavily for hitting this button just because you think they'll do it and then they don't. But if it's your main threat at the time, if you think your biggest danger is your opponent going for this and you not reacting, then you might as well hit it. Our upcoming Guilty Gear content should be, in fact, released tomorrow. It does require some final review, but Just Fine's been working really hard on all of the pages for you. And therefore we're expecting it to be at least in release workable state tomorrow, even if it does need some tweaks or something that I have to do. Note that once again, for Guilty Gear, the characters don't all have the same options, so if you find that the exercise does not seem to be possible for your character, that in itself is the lesson. You should, however, probably try for a while. Maybe if you're specific already about your understanding of the game or frame data or the character you definitely want to use, look up some stuff and double check whether or not the options we are mentioning as a lot of them are hard enough that you might find yourself thinking it's not possible with my character, when really it's that it's super hard. The fact that it makes it so difficult to tell, however, means that sometimes you should make the decision based on that being the same. If you are a beginner trying to get used to Guilty Gear and something is theoretically possible but so difficult that you end up not thinking it is, maybe you're better off actually waiting for someone to specifically tell you as advice when you understand the game or the character better, no, you can actually do this thing. Well, I personally thought that was a dash through. So as they say in the business, I would have got hit. One problem you will quickly see here is that G has a lot more close range layers than Bison. Bison has to do crazier things, as, for example, just Cycle Burst, suddenly doing Devil Reverse, or yes, Devil Reverse. But V-Trigger 1 helps quite a bit with this, as it allows Bison to stay plus while using head stomps. And feint things altogether, like that. would not have had the patience to not anti-air.
Oh, so good.
A reminder of why Bison actually specifically needs the Shadow Axe. Although target combos are among the hardest quote-unquote confirms in this game. I'm not even sure you can call target combos confirms when you do them that way.
Yeah, that was not the best of decisions. Probably would have been better off with the V reversal.
The ability to change your play style or level of aggressiveness at least, effectively on a whim, is actually more so skill related to how random you can be than how specifically good you are. The skill part is in using your awareness of yourself doing it to keep track of your opponent's meter and decide if you need to hold yourself back. In short, you can factor the opponent's general tendencies, how much meter they have, and decide if to hit brakes or not if you realize you're going a little too ham on someone who could actually do a lot of damage to you. However, you can't just decide to do that specifically because you might have a read on whether or not your opponent wants to actually use that meter for anything. Fortunately, in a lot of cases, it depends entirely on how good your opponent's super is and how easy it is for them to confirm it off of certain situations. If their super isn't super good at being put into that use, you can often expect them to eventually need to use something different in neutral, meaning that they end up without as much meter to use for those things. We therefore now go into our last set of the night. Once again, the lounge will in fact end when this set ends, and we are likely to all disperse. We will not, in fact, be having the stream tomorrow, as we will be all guilty geared out by the time we have finalized all of the pages for the exercise. Meaning that our next stream is likely to be more sandbag casuals justifying action on Wednesday. And we should finally be back to a full Kame house on Thursday as well. Friday is actually very likely to be Dead or Alive 6. You can feel free to join us for that as well. No choice there, as even a block could easily lead into super, and with the V trigger already activated, it's very difficult for Alex to do anything about that. that was Shiny Fabulousness by the President, bringing us to the end of our stream for today. You can find all the bots we have mentioned at our website 2-mk.org. Navigation will take you right on through, but you can go straight to 2-mk.org/bots. And all our data about when we're streaming, what, and when we release things will be our Twitter 2_mk_FGC. Therefore, we have come to the end of our stream for tonight. This has been Lillian along with Just Fine for Team 2MK. Good luck with your training, and good night, everyone.